This is the Making Waves podcast. My name is Dave Rutland. We're here with Dan Goeller. Dan, welcome.
Thank you for having me again.
Now, you run a YouTube channel called Lemons on the Prairie.
That is correct. Yeah, it's when I started just sort of waking up to the Marxism that had creeped into our local institutions and among our leadership here in our community, I decided it was time to kind of create a platform where I could basically share the documents and the information, where and how this was happening and who was involved and complicit in it. So I developed a YouTube channel where people can see videos and get information about that and share it.
Well, I'm subscribed.
Yeah,
I encourage everyone to do so.
Thanks.
We spoke before about the Marxist march through the institutions, even here in South Dakota. Could you just brief us, your listeners, about yourself and how you became aware of this issue?
Sure. So as executive director of Harmony, a nonprofit here in Sioux Falls, I was required to more or less participate in some DEI training seminars and requirements that were part of our funding process to receive funding from the Sioux Empire United Way. And so that awakened me, basically opened my eyes to the depth that cultural Marxism had really infiltrated so many of our local institutions. And the leadership didn't seem, in some cases they were openly, supportive of this ideology and agenda, but in some cases they just didn't seem to care. So there was a complacency by some and complicity by others. And my concern was that, particularly with organizations, if you want to quickly align them to a specific ideological agenda, the simplest and quickest way to do that is to say you can't get our money without, participating in this sort of practice. And so that's where I got concerned. I started paying attention. I started, keeping track of all the documents that were going out and the training videos, and I downloaded those, and then I started basically creating documenting all that in short documentarian type videos so I could share that information with people and make my case, because it's hard to do that. Not everybody has the time to sit across the table from one another like we're doing here. So I just thought if I could alert people to what was happening and show them the information, then they could be informed, and that would provide the transparency, and then we could have some accountability to our local leaders and institutions.
And we, of course, went through this in our previous podcast called The March Through the Institutions. I recommend people listen to that. And also, of course, go to your YouTube channel, Lemons on the Prairie. Well, how would you define woke?
I would define woke as basically a compliance structure. So people who have Marxist, neo-Marxist, cultural Marxist, critical theory ideas about how they want to remake the world, essentially use wokeism as an umbrella to get everybody to believe in this narrative and to see the world through the lens of a narrative that says there's always an oppressor and there's always a victim. And so they gain power through a compliance structure which convinces people that if they're the oppressors, they need to relinquish their power. And if they are the victims, then they need to support whatever leaders say that they are going to empower them through these Marxist, left-leaning policies and ideas.
Put it shortly, it's a system where people can declare themselves to be victims and bully everybody else into compliance.
It is, and James Lindsay, who some of your listeners may know from the New Discourses podcast, has a great definition too. He says that wokeness simply defined as calling someone a bigot until they give you your power. And so, it doesn't matter what they call you. They can make it with regard to race or sexuality or whatever, or gender, etc., but eventually they just want your power.
What local organizations here in South Dakota are woke?
Well, obviously, I have direct contact with the Sioux Empire United Way, and I extensively documented the way that the ideology of the left and their influence in the political lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C., trickle all the way down to all the local institutions and the franchises of the United Way throughout the United States. And so people think, well, surely that's not happening here, in our United Way. And our own United Way tries to retreat from this, which I find ironic. It's like, if this is who you are, then just come out and say it and just say, yeah, that's who we are. And if people don't want to give you your money, then they're not going to give you your money. The problem is we have a lot of people that are trying to straddle the middle of this fence, and they want to be somewhat duplicitous about how they're going about this, because they know that there are a lot of conservative people here in our community that would not support them if they were openly, transparent about it.
They wouldn't give their money.
They would not. So they have to be subtle about it, So what they do is they enact it through these sort of compliance bureaucracies where you have to answer questions about how are you doing the work of diversity, equity, inclusion? How is your organization seeing itself through the lens of equity? And then within your local businesses and things, it's like, well, how are we compliant with these ESG, environmental social governance standards, so that we can receive our financial, access and insurance and all these different things. And so what you're seeing is that, for example, so in addition to Student Power United Way, people would say, well, I don't have to give my money to the United Way. Well, that's fine. But many of the United Ways are shifting their revenue model to government grants. So I'll give you one quick example. In Alabama, Central Alabama, so Birmingham area United Way, got $55 million in federal grants in 2021. $55 million. Now, $31 million of that was distributed for HIV care. Now, it's 2022. I'm not unsympathetic to people that have health needs, but that's an insane amount of money, you know what I'm saying, to just be given away to these people if you have a certain kind of ideological slant in terms of how they want to spend that money. And so the problem is that we have what I would call the nonprofit industrial complex, right? These nonprofits get their marching orders from the politicians on the left and these social activism organizations that filter down to all these sort of boutique versions of them. One example locally would be South Dakota Voices for Peace, right? Okay, this is an organization with Denise at the helm. She was defeated as mayor because the people said, we reject these ideas that you are proposing and advocating for. So then how do they get them implemented? They get them implemented because they can get both federal and private sector philanthropic money given to their organizations to do local community organizing and advocating for these ideas and these policies. So two examples. One is in 2019, your local Sioux Falls Area Community Foundation gave a grant so that Tunisia could take 12 women to the Muslim Sisterhood Arise conference. Okay? Now, what do you learn? Now, I'll just read you real quick. So, what is Sioux Falls Voices of Peace? It says that they are envisioning a South Dakota that is diverse, inclusive, and anti-racist. Now, that sounds good on the surface, but again, you and I know if we peel away, well, what is anti-racism? It's actually racism, right? It's saying that you need to see the world through a filter of everything put in terms of racism, where somebody has power and somebody is being oppressed. And any disparity that we see in outcomes based on race that we perceive are always the fault of discrimination. Even if rational evidence shows us that's not the case, that's what sorts of here. Exactly, totally. You don't need proof for it. But when you go to like this Muslim Sisterhood Arise conference, you take courses on intersectionality, confronting white supremacy, unveiling unconscious bias, ally is a verb, etc. And then now, what's current in the news right now, there's a whole section on that website about how to support Palestine because they have the conflict with Hamas and Israel. And so, your AGP, your, Americans for Justice of Palestine, your ANP, all these organizations that you see that are fomenting these local sort of riots and action efforts, where they're banging on the gates of the White House and they're in the Congress and demonstrating all around. And you see these folks in Minneapolis, like surrounding cars and banging on with Palestinian flags. This is the same organization that's tied to all of that. So these national organizations have all of their local and regional sort of sponsors or boots on the ground organizations through which they implement these ideas. And they're generally supported by, like, for example, I'll just name a couple: Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota, the Bush Foundation, et cetera, all your typical large, read some more of those. Yeah, so the McKnight Foundation, the Albert and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation, the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundations, and et cetera. So these are the folks that are funding these Muslim sisterhood folks, right? And then it trickles down because here we also have the Sioux Falls Area Community Foundation gives money to ACE Academy, our local CRT indoctrination school. They give money to the of course, they pay themselves. This is how they put beans on the table. Yeah, exactly. And that's how they can spend so much time doing this ideological indoctrination. They don't have to have jobs since they're being paid through these. Absolutely. And then you have like the South Dakota Urban Indian Health, having the Two-Spirit Powwow, with the Sioux Falls Pride Organization, and the Transformation Project, which lobbies for what they call gender-affirming care, got their startup money from the Sioux Falls Area Community Foundation. There's also one, and also like if you look at Chamber of Commerce is another one. For those people that pay attention to what's going on in the state House and Peer in the Senate, you notice that the Chamber of Commerce is always one of the most active lobbying organizations in the state of South Dakota. I'm talking about the Sioux Falls area, Chamber of Commerce. And so,
good distinction.
Exactly. And it's like, well, I have a question. I used to give money to them because, we had the blue ribbon cutting, and my board of directors said, oh, we should belong to the chamber and get the blue, and they come and they cut the ribbon and you get your picture on the paper and it's great for it and all. Then I'm like, why? Okay, whatever. And then after a couple of years, I started looking like, why are you paying several $100s a year for a membership in an organization for which I don't see what the benefit is? What did they do? And I started looking at what they do, and it's like, well, they're a lobbying organization. That's essentially what they do. In addition to leading diversity, equity, inclusion summits and training seminars, their main function is to basically lobby what they think serves the best interest of supposedly the business, people who pay their membership dues. But here's the problem. They're always on the side of the largest corporations. So when vaccine mandates were, in the thing, when it came to transgender care, they're always lobbying in favor of the things that serve the biggest corporations like Sanford. And this does not serve the interests of the business community. I mean, nobody in especially small business, absolutely not. I don't want, people telling me that I have to vaccinate my employees or I have to do this or that or whatever. All those kind of woke, quote-unquote, ideas are things that most business people, particularly the business people, reject. We want more access to marketplace and less compliance bureaucracy. But they're always on the side pushing about this stuff. And when you look at that, you wonder, why would they do that? And the only answer to the question is because the largest corporations benefit from it, of course. And those are the people that pull the strings. Look at who sits on the board of directors of those organizations. You see, it's the same people who sit on the board of directors of the United Way, which is the Sioux Falls Area Community Foundation. It's always that same cabal of people that are basically serving their own interests through the philanthropic sector, as they call it.
Let's kind of go back to funding and how they get their funding. Could you explain to me how these supposed nonprofits get their funding, not just through the government grants, but through any means?
Yeah, so there's different ways. So like with a structure like the United Way, it's basically corporate fundraising, okay? So our local United Way has not diversified the revenue much yet to seek federal and state grants. Most of their money is coming directly from what they call employee campaigns. So they go to you've probably seen right on the news and whatever, this is everywhere but the problem is I haven't had many conversations with people who kind of go, ugh, when they talk about when you would say the United Way, because they're like, it's very coercive, it's sort of like, it's like shearing the sheep. Exactly. It's like going to a timeshare meeting, it's like, you're not going to leave the room until we have your donation kind of a thing. Wow. You know what I mean? That's the feel that a lot of people have. Now they dress it up with all these, they give you incentives, they do drawings, they have, free food, all these events that businesses invest in to try to get people there. But at the end of the day, it's like they want to look good. And the thing is, it's great for them because that fulfills their ESG requirements, because the United Way collects and is using this wokeness bureaucracy to show that they're in compliance with these diversity, equity, inclusion ideas, right? So then when the business comes to them and says, well, what have we done with our philanthropic dollars? Do we get our dollars? Do we get our ESG credit? Then the United Way says, oh, absolutely. Look, here are the list of the identity characteristics of the people that we supported through the funding agencies to see how this works, right? So the corporations love it because they get to check the philanthropy box. And even if they're not, quote unquote, woke, they have to be because they're under the purview of these ESG qualifications now, right, and requirements. So they love it. It's easy. Oh, we check the box, we're done, right?
It's a lot like in buying indulgence.
It is.
Back in the Middle Ages, you buy an indulgence from the church for whatever.
So you get a pass for whatever you do. That's exactly right. Like, we don't actually have to address the issue.
As long as you pay out.
As long as you pay.
You get your check.
You are, absolutely.
And this whole system would fall apart and people would simply not comply.
Yeah, I would use Target and Bud Light as a great example of when the philanthropic wings of corporate, corporations basically go woke, then people need to disinvest themselves. Because what does disinvestment do? It disincentivizes the behavior of those businesses, okay? Now, the problem is you've seen with Target and with, the Target CEO just went on TV for an interview this week and doubled down on the lies about this stuff, how they weren't doing the things that they were caught doing. And I know Bud Light was doing the same thing. And they were, absolutely. They just deny it, and think, well, eventually this will go out of the news and nobody will care.
And previously they're right.
Yeah.
They're right. People just lose interest.
Yeah. And it's interesting to note that within the business community, you have alternatives. Like, I don't have to shop at Target. I can shop somewhere else, right? If I drink beer, I could drink a different beer than Bud Light, right? But the problem is that with your local community organizations, a lot of people, I honestly don't understand the structure. I try to have a conversation with the folks at the Sioux Falls Area Community Foundation. They said, well, we're not here to debate or have a conversation about who we're funding. because it's complicated. This is what they always say. They always talk about, well, it's very complicated. We have a lot of different interests. We're trying to keep the peace between these divisive factions of people on the left and the right. And we have everybody included. They're BS. Yeah, absolutely. And it's like
obfuscating.
Yeah, because they can't defend the fact that they're supporting things that they know are harmful to the community, but they have to, kind of keep singing this refrain of equal representation. We want to represent all the different diverse people within a community. And it's like, well, when you're talking about people that want to, sterilize and mutilate kids' bodies, I don't know how you justify funding organizations that that's their main goal, and that's what they advocate.
And that's what they obfuscate.
Absolutely. So that's the problem.
Let's talk a little bit what they spend the money. Now, we briefly talked about how much they get, from corporations and from coercive fundraising. How do they spend the money? What kind of programs that they put together?
Sure. So let's use a company example. So Sioux Falls Area Community Foundation went into the Muslim Sisterhood Rise conference in Minneapolis in 2019. When you go to that conference, you learn, you could take courses on intersectionality, resisting white supremacy, and all these kind of typical, it's all anti-racism kind of stuff from Ibn Kendi and the usual people, right? And so the idea is you're basically indoctrinating people and teaching them how to become social activists and organized community organizers, because that's what Tanisha's done here. And so she's looking to the people who have the quote-unquote best practices and the thought leaders within the movement as to how to train people. I'll give you one quick example. Right now in the news, we have a thing with Hamas and Israel. And what's fascinating about it is this organization, the Muslim Sisterhood Rise folks, they have ties to that, right? The Americans for Justice in Palestine, the American Muslims in Palestine, these large national organizations are all tied to these regional and local organizations like that. And so that's how it filters through all the way down to here to Sioux Falls. Another example is every summer, the South Dakota Voices for Peace sponsors the Cohort to Courage. Well, sounds great, right? But what is it? It's basically a week-long summer camp for teenagers and people in their young 20s, college-age students, to come and learn best practices for community organizing, right? And so there's actually, I'm trying to put together a video on Lennis on the Prairies to show, what they do when they graduate. They basically have a little, conference where they invite the public to come, and they do land acknowledgements where they apologize, for decolonize, and they want to decolonize the land that everything in the United States is built on, which doesn't make any sense, but how would that work? You know what I'm saying? It's the same language that's being used by this nihilistic sort of mentality, but says, look, there's an oppressor, so we need to take the land back from whoever that is. No idea about what that should look like. You notice, like in Palestine, it's a great example of, they don't want a two-state solution. What is it, from the river to the seas, Palestine be free? They don't want. They just want the Jews.
They don't want solutions.
They don't
want the conflict.
They do. They want the conflict because it basically foments revolution. And in these processes, critical consciousness requires a constant scroll, right? Between the oppressor and the victim, because that empowers the people who pull those strings as leverage to basically mobilize these people who see themselves as victims.
It's not about justice. It's not about right or wrong. It's about the destruction of civilization.
It is completely. And that's the thing that people need to realize, is that what started off as Marxism migrated to the default of cultural Marxism with Foucault and people like we've talked about, Frankfurt School. And then it's this critical consciousness. Now it's like, well, why are these LGBTQ people aligned with these? It's because it's all the idea of, I have to see everything through the lens of critical theory, which means that somebody's oppressing somebody and I need to be on the right side. Even they talk a lot about being on the right side of history, and undoing the sins of the past and all that. It has religious theological language, of course. And the final thing I would say is that now I think it's evolved to the next stage. And this is where it's getting really dangerous now in our country. What you saw in the summer of 2020, and I predict will happen exponentially worse in 2024 with the election coming, is that it's a nihilistic worldview. There's no rationality to it anymore. It's not just having critical consciousness. It's about believing that no matter what the system is, it needs to be destroyed. And they don't even talk about replacing it with anything. They just want to destroy it and burn it down.
And moreover, they give themselves a rationalization to do things that are destructive, violence, and destructive property. And that makes them the righteous one, and they don't need to justify it at all.
Yeah, it's very much a cultural, I would say it's a cultic theological system. And so they're operating on a sort of what you would look at in a religious system as like a faith base or a mythology. It's really a logical model.
That's one of the ways to look at Marxism, is that it's a religion.
It is. It's definitely a replacement for any kind of genuine.
That's why they hate Christianity.
They do. They hate it, and the family as well, because because again, it's like, well, the family is a patriarchal system where the family, the mothers and fathers, the parents. That's why gender affirming care is rooted in, queer theory. Queer critical theory is rooted in Marxism, because it says that, well, parents shouldn't have the right to deprive a child. Children should be able to declare themselves to be whatever they want, and we have to apply that. Because the parents are seen as the oppressor in that relationship. God is seen as the oppressor in the religious structure, right? So everyone you can name, they're against it because they just want to be able to participate in whatever kind of nihilistic anarchy they can think of.
This is so confusing to normal people because this is not the way normal people think.
And the sad thing for me is that so much of the work that's done, you asked about where does the funding go? Most of it goes towards training and advocacy work, because that is the ultimate goal. They want people to see the world through the critical lens of who's oppressing me. And whether it's your race, or your sexuality, or your gender, or your sexual identity, or any category you can think of, they keep dividing and creating new ones. And I'm pretty sure of disability or anything. Yeah, they will basically tell you, somehow you're a victim, so you need to get on our side and give us your power, and we're going to work together to overcome this.
Well, then, what I'd like to recommend to our listeners is don't comply.
Absolutely.
Don't give them money. Stand up to them. That's the only thing you can do.
Yeah, I agree. And so be educated, and share it too, I mean, because what I found is that I've gotten some really great feedback and support from people saying, thank you. I didn't know our United Way, or I didn't know this organization was doing that. And I think that's something that
they're the wolves in sheep.
Yeah, they are. And I think maybe at another time we should have a conversation, because the next step is provide the transparency by raising awareness, among your colleagues and your friends and the people within your social network. And then the next step is be smart about how can we provide some disincentivizing of this thing. Like, it's easy to disinvest yourself from a United Way or don't give to this charity or whatever. But what do we do about the organizations who are well-funded by people on the left, like the Soros-type folks, that want to see this, and the corporations who are just dumping money into it? And we've got these foundations, like you look at the Ford Foundation, the Annie Casey Foundation, some of these that you hear all the time, is like this program supported by on public radio, whatever. These organizations, or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, these folks have billions of dollars to throw at this stuff. That's why it's so well funded and so well organized, because these people get paid to do this stuff. Like you mentioned, full money. They absolutely do. And so it's hard for us who are living our lives and just want to be left alone, right? Want to be free, to figure out how to combat that. And that's where I think the next step is to figure out what are some simple ways that we can mobilize ourselves to really push back against this effectively.
Well, first thing I would suggest is subscribe to Londonist on the Prairie.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dan, thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for that.
This has been the Making Waves podcast. My name is Dave Rowland, and we've been here with Dan Goeller.